The September rain drummed against the kitchen window like Linda's fingers used to tap when she was thinking hard about something. 3 weeks had passed since we buried her, 3 weeks since the last casserole dish was returned and the final sympathy card arrived, yet the house still echoed with the phantom sounds of her presence. I sat at our old oak table, the one we'd bought at an estate sale in Zanesville 32 years ago, turning the small velvet box over in my weathered hands like a prayer I wasn't sure how to speak. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from as we begin this journey together. The jewelry box had appeared in Linda's underwear drawer like a secret whispered from beyond. Not hidden, exactly, but placed with the careful precision she reserved for things that mattered deeply. Tucked beneath her silk scarves, the ones she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. Inside lay pieces I'd never seen before. A diamond tennis bracelet that caught the gray morning light and threw it back in brilliant fragments, matching earrings that seemed to hold fire within their carefully cut stones, and a necklace so elegant it made my breath catch in my throat. The accompanying note, written in Linda's careful cursive on cream-colored paper, was brief but weighted with meaning. For when you understand why, Harold, love always L. The strangeness of it settled in my bones like winter frost penetrating old mortar. In 43 years of marriage, Linda had never been one for expensive jewelry. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin from decades of faithful wearing, and the modest pearl earrings I'd given her for our 10th anniversary were the extent of her collection, or so I'd believed with the certainty of someone who thought he knew his wife's every preference. She'd always claimed such things were impractical, money better spent on the grandchildren's college funds or the new roof we'd needed 5 years back when those April storms had torn half the shingles from our modest colonial. My daughter Jessica had been by the house twice since the funeral, her designer heels clicking impatiently across our hardwood floors as she surveyed what remained of her mother's life with the efficiency of someone conducting inventory. Each visit carried the subtle weight of evaluation, as if she were calculating the worth of memories and measuring the space between grief and practicality. "Dad, we really need to start going through Mom's things," she'd said during her last visit, her manicured fingers already reaching for Linda's jewelry box on the dresser, the everyday one with the broken clasp and the faded blue velvet lining that had held her simple treasures for as long as I could remember. "I could help you sort through her clothes, maybe donate them to Goodwill. It's not healthy to keep everything exactly as she left it." She'd paused, eyes scanning the modest pieces with barely concealed disappointment, her expression suggesting she'd hoped for something more substantial, more worthy of the effort. "And her jewelry? Well, there's not much there, is there? Just sentimental value, really." That afternoon, when Jessica left with her arms full of Linda's cardigans and her promises to return with boxes for proper packing, something my wife had said during her final weeks kept circling back through my mind like smoke that wouldn't clear. She'd been sitting in her hospital bed at Ohio Valley Regional, the morphine making her words soft and sometimes disconnected, when she suddenly gripped my hand with surprising strength that belied her failing body. "Harold," she'd whispered, her blue eyes more focused than they'd been in days, cutting through the pharmaceutical haze with startling clarity. "Jessica doesn't need to know everything right away. Some things have their own timing. Promise me you'll remember that." At the time, I'd attributed it to the medication, the way pain can make thoughts wander down strange corridors of memory and concern. But now, with this unexpected treasure heavy in my hands and Jessica's efficient sorting fresh in my memory, Linda's words carried a weight I hadn't recognized then. My wife had always been protective of our family, sometimes in ways that bordered on secretive, managing challenges and solutions with quiet competence that I'd taken for granted. The afternoon light was fading across our small town of Millbrook, Ohio, population 8,400, when I heard the familiar sound of Jessica's BMW pulling into our gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched her navigate the puddles with practiced care, her expensive coat pulled tight against the persistent Ohio drizzle that had been falling since dawn. She'd be expecting coffee, expecting progress on the sorting she'd started, expecting the quiet compliance that had marked most of our interactions since Linda's diagnosis 6 months ago. But something about the jewelry felt different, charged with a purpose I couldn't yet name. Linda had been deliberate about everything in her final months, updating her will with meticulous precision, organizing her recipes for Jessica with detailed notes about which dishes the grandchildren preferred, even labeling photograph albums with names and dates in case memory failed us in years to come. Nothing Linda did was accidental, especially not in those final, precious weeks when every breath was measured and every word carried the weight of goodbye. The memory of Linda's hands shaking as she sealed that manila envelope still haunted me whenever I sat in our kitchen's morning light. It had been a Tuesday in June, 2 weeks before her final hospital stay, and she'd been sitting at this same oak table with papers spread before her like pieces of a puzzle only she understood. The early summer heat had already begun building outside, promising another sweltering Ohio day, but Linda had wrapped her thin shoulders in the lavender shawl our daughter-in-law had given her for Christmas. "Harold," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular weight it held when she was about to share something important. "I need you to promise me something." The envelope in her hands was thick with contents I couldn't see, sealed with old-fashioned red wax like something from a bygone era, when secrets were kept with ceremony and intention. Back then, I'd assumed it was more of her methodical preparation for the inevitable. Linda had spent those final months organizing everything with the precision of someone who knew she was running out of time to protect the people she loved. She'd updated our wills through Thompson and Associates downtown, organized her recipe collection into a bound notebook with detailed notes about which dishes the grandchildren preferred, even written letters to 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Tyler to be opened on future birthdays when grief had softened enough to allow joy. "Don't open this until you need to understand," she'd said that morning, pressing the envelope into my hands with fingers that had grown thin but maintained their familiar warmth. "You'll know when that time comes, Harold. You've always been better at reading people than you give yourself credit for." Her blue eyes had held mine with an intensity that made my chest tight with premonitions I couldn't name. "And don't let Jessica rush you into decisions. Sometimes love means protecting people from their own nature." I'd tucked the envelope away in my bedroom dresser, beneath the IBEW Local 704 newsletters and old tax forms, thinking it contained sentimental letters or final instructions about her beloved rose garden. Linda had spent 15 years coaxing beauty from the clay soil behind our house, creating a sanctuary of hybrid teas and climbing roses that drew compliments from neighbors and strangers alike. Even now, in late September, her David Austin roses continued blooming with stubborn determination, as if her love sustained them beyond reason. But Jessica's behavior since the funeral had begun to illuminate patterns I'd been too grief-stricken to recognize initially. She'd arrived at Ohio Valley Regional during Linda's final days with a leather portfolio, asking detailed questions about bank accounts and insurance policies while her mother dozed fitfully between waves of morphine-managed pain. At the time, I'd been grateful for Jessica's practical nature, her MBA training that allowed her to handle details when my world felt like it was dissolving around the edges like watercolors in rain. "Dad, you know I worry about you managing everything alone," Jessica had said during her visit last week, settling into Linda's chair at the kitchen table with her tablet and that same leather portfolio. She'd been scrolling through what looked like financial websites, occasionally jotting down numbers in the precise handwriting she'd inherited from her mother. "I've been thinking about your situation here, and honestly, this house is too big for one person. The property taxes alone are eating up nearly $3,000 annually from your fixed income." She wasn't wrong about the financial pressure. Our modest colonial on Maple Street carried an annual tax burden that grew heavier each year as the county reassessed property values, while my pension from 38 years at the power plant remained static. My monthly income totaled $3,170 between pension and Social Security, comfortable enough for Linda and me during our careful years together, but increasingly tight as utility costs climbed and unexpected expenses emerged like cracks in aging foundations. "I've been researching senior communities," Jessica had continued, her enthusiasm building as she warmed to her subject with the fervor she usually reserved for client presentations. "There's Golden Meadows, about 20 minutes from my house in Dublin. The monthly fee covers everything: utilities, meals, activities, even housekeeping. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work anymore." The cost she'd mentioned, $3,200 monthly for a one-bedroom apartment, would consume most of my income, leaving little for the small gifts I enjoyed giving Emma and Tyler, or the occasional dinner at Applebee's with my neighbor Frank. But Jessica had pressed forward, showing me glossy brochures filled with smiling seniors engaged in crafts and card games. their faces wearing the determined cheerfulness of people adjusting to circumstances they'd never imagined choosing. "Think about it, Dad," she'd said, gathering her materials with practiced efficiency. "You could sell this place, pay off the remaining mortgage balance, and have a substantial nest egg left over. I could help you invest it properly through my financial advisor, make sure it lasts through your retirement years." The envelope Linda had sealed with such ceremony seemed to pulse with hidden significance in my dresser upstairs. Her warning about timing echoed in my mind with new resonance as I remembered Jessica's calculated enthusiasm about my future financial security. My wife had always been protective of our family's stability, sometimes in ways that surprised me with their quiet complexity and foresight. During the 2008 recession, when my hours at the plant were cut and Jessica was struggling with her fledgling marketing consultancy, Linda had somehow managed to help our daughter with a $15,000 loan that kept her business afloat during those desperate months. I'd never questioned where that money came from, assuming she'd accessed her modest inheritance from her mother's estate. But now, holding evidence of Linda's hidden resources, I wondered how many other financial mysteries my wife had managed with competence that extended far beyond our household budget. The first hint that something felt off came on a Thursday morning in early October, when Jessica arrived unannounced with coffee from that expensive place downtown and what she called just a few forms for me to review. The autumn air carried that particular Ohio crispness that Linda had always loved, the kind that made her want to bake apple pies and organize closets for winter. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, nursing my second cup of coffee and watching the neighbor's tabby cat navigate our back fence with the determination of someone with important business elsewhere. "Dad, I've been thinking more about your financial situation," Jessica said, settling into Linda's chair with the practiced ease of someone claiming territory. The papers she spread across our table looked official. Bank documents, investment forms, something that resembled a power of attorney agreement with language too dense for casual reading. "I talked to my financial advisor yesterday, and he thinks we should consolidate some of your accounts, make everything more streamlined and manageable." The coffee in my stomach suddenly felt too acidic, creating an uncomfortable warmth that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Linda's jewelry box rested upstairs in my dresser drawer, wrapped in one of her silk scarves like a secret that grew heavier each day. "I managed just fine, Jessica," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the strange unease settling in my chest. "Your mother and I always handled our own finances without any problems." "But Dad, that's exactly my point." Jessica's tone carried that patient condescension she used when explaining digital marketing concepts to her older clients. The kind of voice that suggested she was being reasonable while others were being stubborn. "Mom handled the finances. You don't even know what accounts she had or where she kept all the important documents. What if something happens to you? What if you have a medical emergency?" She wasn't entirely wrong about Linda's role in our financial management. My wife had indeed managed our household budget with the efficiency of someone who understood that security came from careful attention to details that others might overlook. But I knew more than Jessica assumed. Knew about our savings account at First National with its modest balance, our small investment portfolio with Edward Jones that Linda checked quarterly, the life insurance policies that would help cover final expenses when my time came. What I hadn't known about was the jewelry, or the careful way Linda had apparently prepared for possibilities I was only beginning to suspect. "I found something interesting when I was helping Mrs. Patterson with her computer issues last week," Jessica continued, her voice taking on that casual tone people use when delivering information they want to seem accidental. Apparently, Mom had been asking her about jewelry appraisals a few months before she passed. Mrs. Patterson thought it was strange, since Mom never seemed interested in expensive things. My hand tightened around my coffee mug until my knuckles went white. Margaret Patterson had been Linda's closest friend for 15 years, ever since they'd served together on the Methodist Church's funeral dinner committee. They'd shared coffee every Tuesday morning, traded gardening tips, and confided in each other with the trust that develops between women who've weathered life's storms in parallel. If Linda had been asking Margaret about appraisals, it meant she'd been planning something specific, something that required professional evaluation of assets I'd known nothing about. "Did Margaret mention what kind of appraisals?" I asked, working to keep my voice neutral despite the electrical current of anxiety running through my nerves. "Oh, just general questions about how the process works, what qualifications to look for in an appraiser." Jessica shuffled through her papers with renewed energy. like someone who'd found a productive new angle to pursue. But it got me thinking, Dad. If Mom had any valuable jewelry we don't know about, we should probably get it properly appraised for insurance purposes or estate planning considerations. The sensation that settled in my chest felt like standing too close to live electrical wires, that crackling awareness that danger was present but not yet clearly defined. Linda's note echoed in my memory. For when you understand why. The timing of Jessica's sudden interest in jewelry, combined with her financial advisor's recommendations and her growing urgency about my living situation, began forming a pattern I didn't want to recognize, but couldn't ignore. I've been thinking we should do a complete inventory of Mom's personal effects, Jessica said, her fingers already reaching for her phone to make notes in the app she used for client management. This weekend might be perfect. We could go through everything systematically. Her dresser drawers, the jewelry boxes, even that old cedar chest in the closet. Make sure we haven't overlooked anything valuable. The jewelry box upstairs seemed to pulse with weight, Linda's diamonds catching imaginary light in my mind's eye. Whatever my wife had been trying to protect me from understanding too quickly was beginning to reveal itself in Jessica's methodical interest in assets and her advisor's convenient timing. The forms spread across our kitchen table represented more than simple financial planning. They suggested a level of preparation that felt calculating rather than caring. There's no rush, I said finally, gathering the papers into a neat stack and sliding them back toward Jessica. Your mother just passed 3 weeks ago. Some things deserve more time before we make big decisions. Jessica's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of impatience before her professional smile returned. Of course, Dad. I just want to make sure you're protected. That's what Mom would have wanted. But as I watched her pack up her materials with efficient disappointment, I wondered if Linda's hidden jewelry and cryptic note suggested she'd been protecting me from something entirely different than what Jessica claimed to have in mind. The investigation began quietly, the way most important discoveries do, with a phone call that seemed innocent enough on the surface. I'd waited until Jessica left for her business trip to Cincinnati before reaching out to Margaret Patterson, Linda's Tuesday morning coffee companion for all those years. Margaret had always been the kind of neighbor who noticed things without making a fuss about it, the type of woman who could tell you which houses had new cars in their driveways and which families were struggling without ever seeming like a gossip. Harold, it's so good to hear from you, Margaret said when I called Thursday morning, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her such a comfort to Linda during those difficult months. I've been meaning to stop by with another casserole, but I didn't want to intrude on your grieving time. We talked about ordinary things first, the unseasonably warm October weather, the Henderson boys' acceptance to Ohio State, the way Linda's roses were still blooming despite the early frost warnings. But when I finally worked up the courage to ask about the jewelry appraisals Jessica had mentioned, Margaret's tone shifted in a way that made me sit up straighter in my kitchen chair. Oh, honey, Linda was very particular about that conversation, Margaret said, her voice dropping to the confidential level she'd used when sharing concerns about other neighbors' troubles. She made me promise not to mention it to anyone, especially not to Jessica, said she was handling some financial planning that needed to stay private for a while. The word especially hit me like a physical weight. Linda had specifically wanted to keep Jessica uninformed about her jewelry inquiries, which suggested a level of intentional secrecy that went far beyond simple estate planning. Did she say why it needed to stay private? I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. She didn't give me details, but she seemed worried about something. Not about her health. We both knew that situation was what it was. This felt different, like she was trying to protect something important. Margaret paused, and I could hear her making tea in her kitchen next door, the familiar sounds of a woman who'd perfected her routines over decades of living. She did ask me about my nephew Danny's credentials. Danny Patterson worked as an independent appraiser in Columbus, specializing in estate jewelry and antiques. I'd met him at a few neighborhood barbecues over the years. A quiet, methodical man in his 40s who'd built a reputation for discretion among clients who valued privacy as much as accuracy. If Linda had been considering his services, it meant she'd been planning something that required professional evaluation and absolute confidentiality. Would Danny remember if she contacted him? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Client confidentiality is sacred in his business, Margaret replied carefully. "But Harold, if you needed to speak with him about Linda's affairs, I'm sure he'd understand the circumstances. He's always been fond of you both." After ending the call with Margaret, I spent the rest of the morning walking through our house with new eyes, looking for other signs of Linda's hidden preparations. The manila envelope she'd sealed with wax remained in my dresser drawer, but now it felt less like a sentimental keepsake and more like a piece of evidence in a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Her careful instructions about timing, her specific warnings about Jessica's involvement, and her secretive inquiries about jewelry appraisals painted a picture of a woman who'd been protecting something significant. That afternoon, I drove to First National Bank where Linda and I had maintained our checking account for 23 years. Sarah Chen, the customer service representative who'd helped us refinance our mortgage in 2019, greeted me with the gentle sympathy that bank employees reserve for recent widowers dealing with financial transitions. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, guiding me to her desk in the small office area behind the main lobby. "Mrs. Morrison was always such a pleasure to work with. How can I help you today?" I explained that I was trying to understand all of Linda's financial arrangements, making sure I hadn't overlooked any accounts or safety deposit boxes that might need attention. Sarah pulled up our records on her computer screen, her professional demeanor reassuring as she walked me through the familiar details of our joint checking and savings accounts. "I don't see any other accounts listed under Mrs. Morrison's name," she said after several minutes of careful review. "But I should mention that she did inquire about opening a safety deposit box back in May. Ultimately, she decided against it, but she spent quite a bit of time asking about the privacy policies and access procedures." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Linda had been considering secure storage for something valuable, something that required more protection than our home could provide. When she decided against the safety deposit box, she'd apparently chosen to keep whatever it was hidden in our house, trusting that I would discover it when the time was right. The drive home took me past Golden Meadows, the senior community Jessica had been promoting with such enthusiasm. The facility looked pleasant enough, well-maintained buildings surrounded by carefully manicured landscaping that suggested competent management and adequate funding. But as I sat in the parking lot, watching residents navigate the sidewalks with walkers and wheelchairs, I realized that Linda's hidden jewelry represented more than sentimental value or even significant monetary worth. It represented choice, the freedom to make my own decisions about my future, rather than accepting the limitations that Jessica's financial planning seemed designed to impose. If Linda had been accumulating valuable assets without Jessica's knowledge, she'd been creating options that her systematic daughter hadn't factored into her calculations about my capabilities and needs. That evening, I called Danny Patterson. His voice carried the careful professionalism I remembered from neighborhood gatherings, but when I explained who I was and mentioned Linda's name, his tone warmed considerably. "Mr. Morrison, I'm very sorry for your loss. Your wife contacted me several months ago about some appraisal work, but we never had the chance to complete the consultation." He paused, choosing his words with the precision his profession demanded. "If you'd like to discuss her inquiries, I'd be happy to meet with you. Some matters are better handled in person." We arranged to meet the following Tuesday at his office in Columbus. As I hung up the phone, Linda's voice seemed to whisper through our quiet house. "You'll know when that time comes, Harold." The time for understanding was approaching faster than I'd expected. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October wind that strips leaves from trees with ruthless efficiency. I drove to Columbus through rural Ohio countryside that Linda had always loved, past farms where corn stubble stood like broken promises in harvested fields. Danny Patterson's office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house on High Street, the kind of building that whispered discretion and old money respectability to clients who valued both qualities above flashy appearances. Danny himself was exactly as I remembered, a man in his mid-40s with careful eyes and the methodical movements of someone who'd built his reputation on precision rather than charm. His office reflected the same quiet competence, lined with reference books and display cases containing examples of the antique jewelry and timepieces that formed his specialty. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for coming," he said, offering me coffee from a small machine that looked expensive and well-maintained. "I've been thinking about your wife since you called. She struck me as someone who understood the importance of being prepared for various possibilities." I settled into a leather chair that had probably witnessed countless conversations about family treasures and difficult decisions. The jewelry box sat heavy in my jacket pocket, Linda's diamonds waiting for professional evaluation, and whatever truths that assessment might reveal. Linda contacted me in late May, Danny continued, consulting a leather appointment book that suggested he preferred old-fashioned record-keeping to digital alternatives. She had questions about valuation procedures, insurance documentation, and the legal requirements for establishing provenance on inherited pieces. Very thorough questions, the kind that suggested she was dealing with items of significant value. "Did she bring anything for you to examine?" I asked, though something in his manner suggested the answer would be more complex than yes or no. "She brought photographs," Danny said carefully. "High-quality images of several pieces that appeared to be quite valuable. A diamond tennis bracelet, matching earrings, and a necklace that looked like it might have been part of an estate collection. She was very particular about maintaining confidentiality during our consultation." The coffee in my hand suddenly felt too hot. Linda had not only known about the jewelry I'd discovered, she'd been actively planning how to handle its value and documentation. The photographs meant she'd been preparing for this discovery months before her death, orchestrating my education about assets I'd never suspected existed. She asked specific questions about timing, Danny continued, his professional discretion evident in the careful way he chose his words. Whether appraisals needed to be completed immediately for estate purposes, or whether they could be delayed if circumstances warranted patience. She seemed particularly concerned about family dynamics and how sudden revelations about valuable assets might affect relationships. I pulled the jewelry box from my pocket, setting it on Danny's desk with the reverence Linda's hidden gift deserved. "These are the pieces from the photographs," I said simply. Danny's eyes lit up with the focused attention of an expert encountering something genuinely remarkable. He moved to his desk lamp, adjusting the light with practiced precision before opening the box with the careful movements of someone who understood that first impressions in his business were often the most reliable. "Beautiful pieces," he murmured, lifting the tennis bracelet to examine it under magnification. "The craftsmanship is excellent, and the diamonds are high quality, probably VVS1 clarity, near colorless. This is definitely estate jewelry, likely from the 1940s or early 1950s based on the setting style." For the next 20 minutes, I watched Danny examine each piece with the thoroughness Linda's preparations had obviously anticipated. He noted details about cut, clarity, and setting that meant nothing to my electrician's training but clearly indicated significant value to his practiced eye. Preliminary assessment, without formal certification, puts the total value somewhere between $45,000 and $60,000, Danny said finally, returning the pieces to their velvet housing with careful precision. "These aren't costume jewelry or sentimental pieces with modest worth. This is a substantial asset that would require proper insurance coverage and careful estate planning consideration." The number hit me like a physical blow. $60,000 represented nearly 2 years of my total pension and Social Security income, enough money to fundamentally change my financial independence and future options. Jessica's enthusiastic calculations about my need for assisted living and her advisor's convenient consolidation plans suddenly took on a very different character. "Your wife specifically asked about the timing of disclosure," Danny continued, closing his appointment book with the finality of someone delivering important conclusions. "She wanted to understand how long asset evaluations could remain private within family situations and what legal requirements governed when heirs needed to be informed about discovered valuables." "What did you tell her?" I asked, though something in Linda's methodical preparation suggested she'd already known the answer. I told her the truth, that discovered assets become part of an estate when the surviving spouse chooses to include them, not according to any predetermined timeline. She seemed relieved by that information, as if it confirmed something she'd already suspected about the importance of timing and discretion. The drive home took me past Golden Meadows again, but this time the senior community looked different, less like an inevitable destination, and more like one option among many that Linda had worked to preserve. Her hidden jewelry represented more than monetary value. It represented the freedom to choose my own future rather than accepting the limitations that others might want to impose based on their assessment of my capabilities. That evening, Jessica called from Cincinnati with updates about her business trip and casual questions about my week. "Have you given any more thought to those financial planning documents I left?" she asked, her voice carrying the hopeful tone of someone expecting positive news. "My advisor is available to meet next week if you'd like to move forward with consolidating those accounts." "I'm still thinking things through," I replied, Linda's $60,000 secret warm in my pocket. "Some decisions deserve more time than others." "Dad, I know change is hard, but waiting too long can sometimes create unnecessary complications," Jessica said, her professional efficiency creeping into her daughter's concern. "The real estate market is still strong, and senior communities like Golden Meadows have waiting lists. We wouldn't want to miss good opportunities by being overly cautious." After ending the call, I sat at our kitchen table with Linda's jewelry spread before me under the warm lamplight. Each diamond caught and reflected the illumination like tiny stars, beautiful and valuable and completely unknown to the daughter who'd been calculating my financial limitations with such confident precision. Linda's note lay beside the jewelry. "For when you understand why." The why was becoming clearer with each passing day, each conversation that revealed the careful foundation my wife had built for protecting my independence and dignity from well-meaning family members who might confuse love with control. The manila envelope's wax seal broke with a soft crack that seemed to echo through our quiet kitchen, like the sound of secrets finally ready to be revealed. It was Friday evening, exactly 1 month since Linda's funeral, and the autumn darkness outside pressed against our windows with the weight of winter's approach. Jessica would return from her business trip tomorrow, armed with new urgency about my living arrangements and her advisor's consolidation plans. But tonight belonged to Linda's final lesson in protecting the people we love. Inside the envelope, her careful handwriting covered 3 pages of cream-colored stationery, the kind she'd used for important correspondence throughout our marriage. But these weren't the gentle reminiscences I'd expected. These were detailed financial records, carefully documented observations, and a mother's growing concerns about patterns she'd recognized in our daughter's behavior over the past several years. "My dearest Harold," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found the jewelry and begun to understand why I couldn't tell you about it while I was still fighting to stay with you. What I discovered about Jessica's financial situation would have broken your heart when you were already carrying so much worry about my illness. But now, with time and perspective, I hope you can see what I learned to see. Our daughter isn't the successful businesswoman she's pretended to be." My hands trembled as I continued reading Linda's methodical documentation of discoveries that painted Jessica's life in colors I'd never suspected existed. The marketing consultancy that seemed so prosperous was actually struggling with debt and dwindling clients. The expensive BMW was leased, not owned, with payments that consumed nearly a quarter of Jessica's actual income. The designer clothes, the upscale apartment in Dublin, the confident financial advice. All of it was elaborate scaffolding supporting a lifestyle that had become unsustainable years ago. She borrowed against her business credit lines to maintain appearances, Linda had written in her precise script. $23,000 in credit card debt, another $47,000 in business loans that her consultancy can't support. The loan I gave her in 2008 was never repaid, Harold, and I never told you because I hoped she'd find her way back to stability without burdening you with worry about our daughter's choices. The jewelry, Linda explained, had been her mother's collection. Pieces that had been stored in a safety deposit box for decades after Grandmother Morrison's death in 1987. Linda had retrieved them quietly in March, having them cleaned and appraised while I was dealing with her chemotherapy appointments and the exhaustion that comes with watching someone you love fight a battle they're destined to lose. I realized that Jessica's sudden interest in our finances, her helpful suggestions about your future, weren't coming from a place of pure concern, Linda continued. She's been calculating, Harold. Not maliciously, but desperately. She sees your pension, our savings, this house as solutions to problems she's created but can't solve, the assisted living recommendations, the financial advisor, the urgency about selling our home. It's all designed to give her access to resources that could save her from the consequences of living beyond her means. I set the letter down and walked to the window, staring out at the streetlights illuminating Maple Street's familiar geometry. Our neighbors' houses glowed with the warm light of Friday evening routines. Families settling in for weekend comfort, retirees like Frank Patterson enjoying the peace they'd earned through decades of honest work. The normalcy felt like a rebuke to the revelations spreading across our kitchen table like evidence in a case I'd never wanted to prosecute. The second page detailed Linda's strategy with the thoroughness she'd applied to everything important in our life together. She'd moved the jewelry from her mother's safety deposit box to our house specifically so Jessica wouldn't discover it during the estate settlement process. She'd researched the legal requirements for asset disclosure and confirmed that I could choose when, or if, to reveal the inheritance to our daughter. Most importantly, she'd calculated that the jewelry's value would provide me with options Jessica's financial planning was designed to eliminate. If you sell this house and move to assisted living as Jessica suggests, you'll be giving her access to approximately $85,000 after paying for the first year's residence fees, Linda had written. Within 2 years, that money would disappear into her business debts and lifestyle maintenance, leaving you dependent on her continued generosity for any comfort beyond basic care. The jewelry gives you something else, the power to choose your own future without financial pressure from someone whose judgment has been compromised by desperation. The final page contained Linda's practical suggestions for handling the situation with Jessica, written with the loving firmness she'd used when guiding our children through difficult lessons in their younger years. She recommended patience rather than confrontation, careful observation of Jessica's behavior patterns, and strategic use of the jewelry's value only when and how I chose to reveal it. Don't think badly of her, Harold, the letter concluded. Jessica is struggling, and frightened people sometimes make choices they wouldn't consider under better circumstances. But you don't have to sacrifice your independence to solve problems she created. The jewelry is my gift to your future autonomy. Use it wisely. And remember that sometimes protecting someone means refusing to enable their poor choices. I folded the pages carefully, understanding finally why Linda had sealed them with wax and ceremony. This wasn't just information, it was power and the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly what love had previously obscured. Jessica's helpful efficiency, her financial advisor's convenient recommendations, her urgent concern about my capabilities all looked different now, filtered through Linda's careful observations and maternal insight. The jewelry box sat open on the table, diamonds catching the kitchen light like tiny beacons of independence. Tomorrow, Jessica would return with renewed pressure about decisions that suddenly felt less like helpful suggestions and more like carefully constructed traps designed to solve her problems at the expense of my freedom. But tonight, I sat with Linda's final gift of clarity, understanding at last why she'd insisted that some truths needed their own timing. The time for passive acceptance was ending. The moment for making my own informed choices was about to begin. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that makes promises about winter's approach. Jessica's BMW pulled into the driveway at exactly 10 o'clock, punctual as always when she had an agenda to pursue. I watched from the kitchen window as she gathered an armload of materials from her back seat, more official-looking folders, a laptop computer, and what appeared to be glossy brochures that probably contained updated information about Golden Meadows and its waiting list opportunities. She knocked briefly before using her key, calling out cheerfully as her heels clicked across our hardwood floors. "Dad, I brought bagels from that place you like downtown, and I've got some exciting updates about your financial planning options." I remained seated at the kitchen table where Linda's letter lay folded beside the jewelry box, both hidden beneath this morning's Columbus Dispatch. The newspaper's headlines about rising healthcare costs and senior living expenses felt like cosmic irony, given what I now understood about my daughter's true motivations for helping me navigate those very challenges. "How was Cincinnati?" I asked as Jessica settled into her mother's chair with practiced familiarity, spreading her materials across the table's surface like a general planning a campaign. "Productive, but I spent the whole drive back thinking about your situation here," she replied, opening her laptop with efficient movements. "My financial advisor ran some updated projections, and Dad, the numbers are really compelling. If we move quickly on selling the house, you could have nearly $90,000 to invest after covering your first year at Golden Meadows." The precise figure matched Linda's calculations exactly, confirming that Jessica had been conducting her own detailed analysis of my assets and their potential conversion to liquid resources. But what Linda had seen as exploitation disguised as concern, Jessica presented with the enthusiasm of someone offering a gift too generous to refuse. "I also talked to the director at Golden Meadows," Jessica continued, pulling up spreadsheets on her computer screen. "They have an apartment available immediately if you're ready to make a decision. 1 bedroom, southern exposure, close to the dining room and activities center. It would be perfect for you." "And expensive," I said quietly. watching her face for reactions to resistance she clearly hadn't expected. "Dad, that's exactly why we need to be strategic about this." Jessica's tone carried a hint of impatience wrapped in daughterly concern. "Your current expenses are eating up your income with nothing left for emergencies or healthcare surprises. At Golden Meadows, everything is predictable, manageable, secure." The word secure hung in the air between us like bait in a trap I was finally learning to recognize. Jessica's definition of security meant converting my independence into managed dependency, transforming my assets into solutions for problems I was only beginning to understand she desperately needed to solve. I stood up and walked to our kitchen counter, retrieving Linda's jewelry box from beneath the newspaper with deliberate calm. Jessica's eyes followed my movements with growing curiosity as I returned to the table and set the velvet case directly in front of her laptop. "Before we make any decisions about my future," I said, opening the box to reveal the diamonds that caught our kitchen light and threw it back in brilliant fragments, "I think you should see something your mother left for me." The transformation in Jessica's expression was immediate and unmistakable. Her professional composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure, revealing a mixture of shock, calculation, and something that looked remarkably like panic. She reached toward the tennis bracelet with fingers that trembled slightly before catching herself and pulling back. "Dad, where did you find these?" she asked, her voice taking on the controlled tone she used when trying to manage situations that threatened to spiral beyond her influence. "Mom never mentioned having jewelry like this. Are you sure they're authentic?" "I had them appraised by Danny Patterson," I replied, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of someone finally holding cards worth playing. $45,000 to $60,000, Jessica. Your mother's inheritance from her mother, kept in a safety deposit box for decades until she moved them here specifically so you wouldn't discover them during the estate settlement." Jessica's face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise giving way to calculation. Calculation shifting to something that looked like anger before settling into the practiced smile she used with difficult clients. "Well, that's wonderful, Dad. It means you have even more financial security than we thought. It means Linda was protecting me from something she'd figured out about your financial situation," I said, reaching for the folded pages of my wife's letter. $67,000 in debt, Jessica. A failing business, lease payments you can barely afford, and a lifestyle that's been unsustainable for years. The pretense finally collapsed completely. Jessica's professional mask slipped away, revealing the desperate, frightened woman Linda had recognized and tried to shield me from understanding while I was already carrying the weight of her terminal diagnosis. "Dad, I can explain," Jessica started, but I held up my hand with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years managing electrical systems that demanded respect for proper procedures and safety protocols. "Your mother explained," I said, unfolding Linda's letter and placing it on the table where Jessica could see her mother's careful handwriting documenting the systematic deception. "She knew about the credit card debt, the business loans, the lease payments. She knew you were calculating how to access my assets to solve problems you'd created." Jessica's eyes moved across Linda's letter with growing horror, recognizing the thoroughness with which her mother had documented the financial desperation Jessica thought she'd successfully hidden. She was sick, Dad. The medication, the stress, maybe she wasn't thinking clearly about. She was thinking clearly enough to have these pieces appraised, to research the legal requirements for asset disclosure, and to make sure I'd have options you weren't planning to leave me. I closed the jewelry box with decisive finality. Linda loved you enough to protect you from the consequences of your choices while she was alive, but she loved me enough to make sure those consequences wouldn't become my burden. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that years of carefully maintained pretense had suddenly opened. Outside, our neighbor Frank was raking leaves with the methodical patience of someone whose biggest concern was keeping his yard tidy before winter arrived. The normalcy felt like a rebuke to the revelations filling our kitchen with the weight of fundamental betrayal. "I love you, Jessica," I said finally, my voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd discovered that parental love sometimes requires painful honesty instead of protective enabling. "But I won't sacrifice my independence to subsidize your poor choices. The house stays mine, the accounts stay in my name, and Golden Meadows can keep their available apartment for someone who actually needs it." The tears came first. Not the graceful sadness of someone processing difficult truths, but the desperate sobbing of someone whose last viable option had just evaporated before her eyes. Jessica collapsed forward in her chair, her carefully constructed professional demeanor dissolving completely as the weight of exposure settled over her like a heavy blanket she couldn't throw off. "Dad, you don't understand how bad things have gotten," she gasped between sobs, her makeup running in dark streams down cheeks that looked suddenly years older than her 42 years. "The business is failing. I'm 3 months behind on the lease payments, and if I don't come up with $23,000 by December, I'll lose everything I've worked for." The magnitude of Jessica's deception began revealing itself in layers, like peeling back wallpaper to discover dry rot in the walls beneath. Her marketing consultancy hadn't just been struggling, it had been hemorrhaging money for over 2 years as clients disappeared and overhead costs consumed what little revenue remained. The professional confidence she'd displayed, the expensive clothes and luxury car, the authoritative financial advice, all of it had been elaborate theater designed to hide a financial catastrophe that threatened to destroy not just her business, but her entire carefully constructed life. The credit counselor said my only options were bankruptcy or finding a significant cash infusion within 60 days, Jessica continued, her voice breaking with the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying an impossible secret alone. "When Mom got sick, when I started thinking about your assets and the house value, it seemed like maybe God was providing a solution." The casual way she spoke about Linda's terminal cancer as divine financial intervention hit me like a physical blow. My daughter had been calculating the monetary value of my grief, measuring my wife's death against her own desperate needs, and finding the arithmetic satisfactory enough to build elaborate plans around my assumed compliance. "You thought exploiting your father's grief was God's plan?" I asked, the question emerging with a calm that surprised me. Linda's letter had prepared me for this moment, but experiencing the full scope of Jessica's desperation still felt like stepping into cold water that was deeper than anticipated. "Not exploiting," Jessica protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Helping. I was going to take care of you at Golden Meadows, make sure you were comfortable and safe, and with the money from selling the house, I could save the business, pay off the debts, start fresh. We'd both benefit." The rationalization was so complete, so thoroughly convinced of its own benevolence, that I almost felt sorry for the woman who'd constructed such an elaborate self-deception. Jessica had genuinely convinced herself that manipulating my financial decisions was an act of mutual aid rather than calculated theft disguised as filial concern. "Your mother saw through all of it," I said, holding up Linda's letter with its documented evidence of Jessica's financial lies and strategic deceptions. "She knew about your business failures, your debt, your lease problems. She moved this jewelry specifically to protect me from becoming your solution." Jessica's laptop screen still displayed her carefully prepared spreadsheets showing my projected income and expenses at Golden Meadows. The numbers told a story of managed dependency that would have consumed my assets within 3 years while leaving me reliant on her continued generosity for any comfort beyond institutional basics. But Linda's hidden inheritance had fundamentally altered those calculations, providing me with options Jessica had worked systematically to eliminate. "I need you to leave," I said finally, the words carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade or reconsidered. "Take your financial advisor's forms, your senior living brochures, your consolidation plans. I won't be needing them." "Dad, please," Jessica begged, reaching across the table toward the jewelry box like someone grasping for a life preserver in turbulent water. "We can work something out. Maybe I could borrow against the jewelry value, use it as collateral for a business loan. You wouldn't have to sell the house or change anything about your life." The proposal revealed how little Jessica understood about the fundamental shift that had occurred in our relationship. This wasn't about money or jewelry or real estate values. It was about trust that had been systematically betrayed, parental love that had been weaponized for personal gain, and grief that had been viewed as opportunity rather than sacred ground requiring respectful distance. "The jewelry stays with me," I said, closing the velvet box with finality that echoed through our kitchen like a door slamming shut. "Your mother's gift was protecting my independence, not subsidizing your poor choices." Jessica gathered her materials with shaking hands, her professional portfolio becoming a collection of rejected proposals and failed manipulations. The confident daughter who'd arrived that morning with solutions for my imagined problems was leaving as a desperate woman whose last hope had just been definitively eliminated by her own mother's protective foresight. "I love you, Jessica," I said as she reached our front door, the words carrying both truth and boundaries she'd never had to respect before. "But I won't enable your financial irresponsibility by sacrificing my security. Your problems are yours to solve." She paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the November afternoon light, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to help Linda plant spring flowers in our backyard. But that child had grown into a woman whose love had become conditional on access to resources, whose concern masked calculation, whose solutions required my surrender of autonomy and dignity. "Mom always said you were stronger than people realized," Jessica said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of recognition that couldn't change what had already been revealed. "I guess she was preparing you for this conversation long before I realized it needed to happen." The sound of her BMW pulling away from our driveway felt like the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Linda's jewelry box sat on our kitchen table, diamonds catching the afternoon light with promise rather than burden. My wife's final gift hadn't just been valuable gems. It had been the power to choose my own future based on truth rather than manipulation disguised as love. Outside, Frank Patterson was still raking leaves with methodical patience, and our neighborhood continued its quiet rhythms of retirement and seasonal change. But inside our house on Maple Street, everything had shifted in ways that felt both devastating and strangely liberating. The weeks following Jessica's departure brought an unexpected quality of silence to our house on Maple Street. Not the oppressive quiet of grief, but something cleaner, like the air after a storm has passed and left the world rearranged but somehow more honest. I found myself moving through familiar rooms with a different kind of awareness, no longer anticipating Jessica's helpful visits or her urgent suggestions about my future. The space felt genuinely mine for the first time since Linda's death, shaped by my choices rather than someone else's calculations about my limitations. Margaret Patterson became my most frequent visitor during those November days, appearing at my kitchen door with coffee cake and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from 73 years of watching people navigate difficult transitions. She'd been Linda's confidant during the final months, I learned, listening to concerns about Jessica's financial desperation while maintaining the loyalty that true friendship requires. "Linda was worried sick about telling you," Margaret confided during one of our Tuesday morning coffee sessions. "She knew it would break your heart to learn that Jessica was struggling, but she was more afraid of what would happen if you didn't understand the real reasons behind all that helpful advice about senior living." We sat at the same oak table where Linda had sealed her final letter, where Jessica had spread her financial planning documents, where I'd first opened the jewelry box that changed everything. The kitchen had witnessed the complete arc of revelation and consequence, from desperate manipulation to protective truth-telling to the difficult aftermath of necessary boundaries. "How long did Linda know?" I asked, stirring sugar into my coffee with the methodical movements that had become meditation during these quiet weeks. "She started suspecting something during the spring," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone sharing secrets that had been held in trust. "Jessica's questions about your finances were too detailed, too urgent for simple concern about your well-being, and when Linda started researching Jessica's business, she found public records about the debt, the credit issues, the lease problems. Linda's investigation had been thorough and heartbreaking, conducted during her final months when every day was precious and painful. Instead of spending her remaining energy on bucket lists or sentimental journeys, my wife had dedicated herself to protecting my future from a daughter whose love had become compromised by financial desperation. The jewelry, Margaret explained, represented more than monetary value or even symbolic inheritance. It was Linda's strategy for ensuring that my grief wouldn't be exploited, that my natural desire to help my struggling child wouldn't result in my own financial destruction. She'd calculated exactly how much independence those diamonds could preserve, how many options they represented beyond the managed dependency that Jessica's plans would have imposed. "She made me promise to watch over you during the transition," Margaret said, refilling our coffee cups with the domestic efficiency that had anchored her own long marriage. "Not to interfere, but to make sure you weren't making decisions from loneliness or guilt about Jessica's situation." The guilt had been significant during those first weeks after Jessica's tearful departure. 43 years of parental instinct don't disappear overnight, and the desire to rescue my daughter from consequences she'd created remained strong despite understanding the manipulation she'd attempted. But Linda's letter provided clarity during moments when guilt threatened to override judgment, reminding me that enabling Jessica's poor choices wouldn't help her develop the responsibility she needed to solve her own problems. Danny Patterson called in mid-November with updates about insurance coverage for Linda's jewelry, his professional discretion extending to gentle questions about whether I'd found the consultation helpful for more than just appraisal purposes. His careful inquiry suggested that Linda had shared more about family dynamics than I'd originally understood, perhaps seeking advice about protecting assets from well-meaning relatives whose judgment had been compromised by personal crises. "Your wife was very thoughtful about timing," Danny said during our phone conversation. "She understood that sometimes love requires protecting people from their own desperation, even when that protection feels like punishment." I'd begun wearing Linda's wedding ring on a chain around my neck, the simple gold band resting close to my heart as a reminder that love takes many forms. Some sacrificial, some protective, some requiring the strength to say no when yes would be easier, but ultimately harmful. Jessica's version of love had become conditional on access to resources. Linda's love had been strong enough to preserve my dignity, even when that preservation required difficult truths and painful boundaries. The house itself felt different now that I knew it would remain mine by choice rather than default. I'd begun small improvement projects that Jessica's efficiency-focused visits had made impossible, refinishing the hardwood floors, updating the bathroom fixtures, winterizing the rose garden that Linda had left in my care. Each project reinforced the reality that this space belonged to me, supported by resources I controlled rather than assets someone else was calculating how to access. Frank Patterson stopped by one afternoon with his grandson Tyler, 8 years old and fascinated by the electrical work I was doing in the garage. Watching the boy's curiosity about how switches and circuits function reminded me that there were other ways to be generous with knowledge and time that didn't require financial sacrifice or the surrender of autonomy. "Tyler's been asking about learning basic electrical safety," Frank mentioned, as we watched his grandson examine a junction box with appropriate caution. "His parents think it might be good for him to understand how things work, develop some practical skills." The invitation felt like an unexpected gift, a chance to share knowledge I'd accumulated over 4 decades while maintaining boundaries that protected both my resources and my independence. Teaching Tyler about electrical systems would be genuine generosity, free from the hidden calculations that had poisoned Jessica's version of family concern. As December approached with its promise of holiday traditions that would need reimagining without Linda's organizing presence and Jessica's manipulative involvement, I found myself grateful for the clarity that truth had brought to my circumstances. The jewelry box sat in my bedroom dresser, Linda's diamonds catching morning light through gauze curtains, valuable not just for their monetary worth, but for the freedom they represented. The power to choose my own future based on honest assessment rather than manufactured urgency. Linda's final gift had been more than jewelry. It had been the strength to recognize that sometimes protecting the people we love means refusing to be exploited by their desperation, even when that refusal feels like abandonment rather than the deeper wisdom that distinguishes authentic care from enabling dependency. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of pristine snow that transforms ordinary neighborhoods into something approaching magic. From my kitchen window, I watched Frank Patterson help his grandson Tyler build a snowman in their front yard, the boy's laughter carrying across the crisp air like a promise that joy persists even through the most difficult transitions. 3 months had passed since Jessica's tearful departure from our house. 3 months of learning to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between helping and enabling, between love that protects and love that exploits. The kitchen table held my morning coffee and a small wrapped package that had arrived yesterday via overnight delivery. No return address, but I recognized Jessica's careful handwriting on the label. Inside, I'd found a simple card with 4 words written in her mother's precise script. "I understand now, Dad." Nothing more, but everything that needed saying. The package also contained a business closure announcement, professionally printed, announcing the end of Jessica's marketing consultancy and her enrollment in a financial counseling program designed to help small business owners recover from debt and rebuild their professional lives through more sustainable practices. Linda's jewelry box sat open beside my coffee cup, the diamonds catching morning light and throwing tiny rainbows across our oak table's familiar surface. I'd taken to opening it each morning, not from vanity or obsession with wealth, but as a daily reminder of my wife's extraordinary final gift of protection and foresight. The tennis bracelet, earrings, and necklace had become talismans of independence rather than mere valuable objects, symbols of choices preserved and autonomy maintained through a woman's loving determination to shield her husband from well-meaning exploitation. The phone rang as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. Tyler Patterson's excited voice bubbled through the receiver with 8-year-old enthusiasm, barely contained by holiday morning propriety. "Mr. Morrison, Grandpa Frank said I could call to wish you Merry Christmas and ask if you wanted to see the remote control car Santa brought me." "I'd love to see it, Tyler," I replied, Linda's voice echoing in my memory as she'd answered similar calls from our own grandchildren during happier Christmases. "Bring it over after you've opened all your presents. Maybe we can figure out how the electrical controls work." The invitation represented more than neighborly kindness. It embodied the kind of generosity that enriches rather than diminishes, teaching rather than taking, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than calculated need. Tyler's curiosity about electrical systems had developed into genuine aptitude over the past month, and his parents' gratitude for my patient instruction felt authentically appreciative rather than strategically manipulative. After ending the call, I walked through our house with the contentment that comes from inhabiting space that belongs fully to its occupant. The rooms held Linda's memory in every carefully chosen detail, but they also reflected my own decisions about comfort and utility. I'd replaced the living room carpet with hardwood flooring that was easier to maintain, updated the kitchen appliances with energy-efficient models that reduced monthly utility costs, and converted Linda's sewing room into a small workshop where I could pursue electrical projects and teach Tyler the fundamentals of safe circuit work. The changes represented more than home improvement. They embodied the principle that Linda's jewelry had preserved, the right to make decisions about my own life based on my preferences rather than someone else's assessment of my limitations or their calculations about my assets' potential availability. Every modification reinforced my autonomy while honoring my wife's memory through choices that reflected our shared values of practicality, sustainability, and genuine care for the people we chose to help. Margaret Patterson knocked softly at my back door around noon, carrying a plate of Christmas cookies and the kind of smile that suggested good news worth sharing. "I thought you might like to know," she said, settling into what had become her regular chair at my kitchen table. "Jessica sent me a lovely note yesterday. She's moved into a smaller apartment, found a part-time job with a nonprofit organization, and started attending that financial recovery program I told you about." The relief in Margaret's voice reflected my own complicated feelings about Jessica's situation. Love doesn't disappear when boundaries become necessary, but it requires transformation from rescuing to hoping, from solving to supporting appropriate choices when they finally emerge. Jessica's acknowledgement of her mistakes and her commitment to rebuilding her life responsibly felt like validation of Linda's difficult wisdom about the difference between helping and enabling. She also mentioned that she's been reading about addiction recovery principles, Margaret continued, learning about how family members can inadvertently perpetuate destructive patterns by protecting people from consequences rather than allowing them to develop genuine responsibility. The parallel between financial desperation and other forms of addiction had occurred to me during quiet evenings spent processing the revelations of November. Jessica's manipulation of my grief, her strategic presentation of my limitations, her calculation of my assets' accessibility, all of it followed patterns that addiction counselors recognize as family dysfunction disguised as love and concern. Linda's jewelry had broken those patterns by providing me with resources Jessica hadn't known to calculate, options she couldn't manipulate, and the power to choose appropriate responses based on clear understanding rather than manufactured urgency. The diamonds had been valuable, but their real worth lay in the independence they preserved and the truth they enabled me to speak without fear of becoming helpless or dependent. As afternoon light began slanting through our kitchen windows, I closed Linda's jewelry box and returned it to my bedroom dresser, wrapped carefully in her silk scarves and nested among keepsakes that held sentimental rather than monetary value. The physical treasures had served their purpose by revealing Jessica's desperation and providing me with alternatives to her proposed solutions. Now they could rest quietly, insurance against future emergencies, but no longer active participants in daily decisions about dignity and independence. Tyler Patterson's excited knocking interrupted my reflections, the boy's energy barely contained as he displayed his new remote control car and peppered me with questions about radio frequencies and motor controls. Teaching him felt like the kind of legacy Linda would have approved, sharing knowledge that empowered rather than exploited, building relationships based on genuine mutual benefit rather than hidden calculations about advantage. Evening brought the peaceful satisfaction that comes from navigating difficult terrain with integrity intact. Our house on Maple Street glowed with warm light against the gathering darkness, a haven earned through honest choices rather than comfortable compromises. Linda's presence filled every room not as haunting memory, but as continuing influence, her final gift of protection and truth-telling reverberating through decisions that honored both her love and my own capability. The morning would bring new opportunities to choose generosity over exploitation, teaching over taking, authentic care over manipulative concern. Linda's diamonds rested safely upstairs, valuable but no longer urgent. Symbols of independence preserved through a woman's extraordinary final act of love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.